My parents forced me to marry an old man for money and status. I tried to escape and growing up in a traditional Indonesian family, I always knew there was a possibility that I would be married off through an arranged marriage. It's still a common practice here, especially in more conservative families like mine. But deep down, I had hope. Hope that my parents, as strict as they were, would at least choose someone who was a good match for me, someone I could tolerate, maybe even love in time. I convinced myself that even though I had little control over my future, it wouldn't be that bad. How naive I was. The day my world crumbled was the day my parents told me who they had chosen for me. It wasn't the kind, respectful man I had imagined. No, it was someone I barely knew. An old man from our neighborhood, someone easily 25 years older than me. He had connections with Puk, Urte, Aka, the local community leader, and was wealthy enough to offer a large dowry. That was all that mattered to my parents. Not my happiness, not my future, just the money he could provide and the status he could elevate for them. I protested, of course. I pleaded with them, begged them to reconsider, to think about what this would do to me. But my words fell on deaf ears. My mother, in particular, was relentless. "Do you want to be known as a rebellious daughter?" she asked, her voice cold and unyielding. "Do you want to shame our family? In our culture, to defy your parents is to be branded as anak durhaka, a disobedient, ungrateful child. And in a world where family honor is everything, the weight of that label is unbearable. So, with no one willing to hear me out, I did what I always did. I submitted. I buried my feelings and tried to convince myself that maybe this was for the best. Maybe I could find a way to survive this. The day the old man came to formally propose was one of the darkest days of my life. I was seated in the living room, surrounded by family members, my face numb with dread. He walked in dressed in traditional attire, accompanied by his family. There was no joy in the air, at least not for me. My parents were all smiles, but I felt like I was being led to my execution. When he placed the engagement ring on my finger, my hands trembled. I wanted to rip it off, throw it across the room, and scream that I wasn't some object to be bought with a shiny rock. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, tears brimming in my eyes as I looked down at the gold band that now adorned my hand, a symbol of the life I didn't want. My heart broke that day, and no one seemed to care. I remember the pitiful glances from some of my extended family, but no one stood up for me. No one said anything. It was as if everyone had accepted this as my fate, and I was expected to do the same. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. But what could I do? Run away? Where would I go? How would I survive? The day of the wedding arrived faster than I had anticipated. I felt like I was floating through the preparations, detached from reality. The makeup artist worked on my face, painting me into a bride while I sat there, expressionless. I could hear my mother in the background, barking orders at me to smile, to act happy, to be the perfect daughter on this important day. How could I smile when I was being forced into a marriage with a man I didn't love? A man I didn't even like? The ceremony itself felt like a blur. I stood next to my husband, who looked like he could be my father, or worse, my grandfather. I could hear people murmuring about how fortunate my family was, about the large dowry he had offered. No one cared about how I felt. I was just a commodity in their eyes, sold to the highest bidder. When the imam declared us husband and wife, I felt like my soul had left my body. My legs shook as I walked out of the mosque, but I kept my head down, knowing that if I showed any sign of rebellion, my parents would berate me even more. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but it felt like the end of everything. After the wedding, I was taken to his house, our house, as they called it now. I wanted to vomit. My parents didn't come to check on me. They didn't call to see how I was adjusting. It was as if they had washed their hands of me the moment the ceremony ended. I was no longer their responsibility. I was his problem now. When we arrived, I immediately asked him where my room was. Without a word, he led me to a small bedroom in the back of the house. I locked the door behind me as soon as he left. I didn't even bother changing out of my wedding dress. I collapsed onto the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. I felt trapped, like a prisoner in my own life. That first night, I cried myself to sleep, grateful for one thing, that he hadn't tried to force himself into the room. I knew it was only a matter of time before I would be expected to fulfill my duties as his wife, but for now, I was spared. The days that followed were a blur of misery. He was busy with his work most of the time, coming home late and leaving early in the morning. I stayed locked in my room, only venturing out when I knew he wasn't home. I didn't eat much. I didn't speak to anyone. I was simply existing, waiting for something to change, even though I knew nothing would. I wandered around the house when he wasn't home, trying to make sense of my new life. During one of my explorations, I found the money from the wedding, thick envelopes filled with cash, neatly tucked away in his wardrobe. The sight of it made me sick. This was what my parents had sold me for. It was then that an idea began to form in my mind. A desperate, dangerous idea, but the only one that seemed like a way out. I couldn't live like this. I wouldn't. If my parents didn't care about my happiness, then why should I care about theirs? Why should I continue to be the obedient daughter they expected me to be when all they had done was betray me? I made up my mind. I was going to leave. I was going to take the money and run. I waited a few more days, making sure that my plan was foolproof. He was still too busy to notice what I was up to, coming home late and barely speaking to me when he did. I had already packed a small bag of essentials, and one morning, when he left for work, I went into the wardrobe and took the envelopes of money. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to get me out of this hell and start a new life somewhere far away. I didn't care if my parents would be angry, or if they would be shamed by my actions. They hadn't cared about my happiness, so why should I care about their honor? With my bag in hand and the money safely tucked away, I walked out of that house without looking back. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't say goodbye. I just left, feeling a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through my veins. For the first time in my life, I was making a decision for myself, not for anyone else. I moved to a city far away, one where no one knew me or my family. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and started fresh. It wasn't easy at first. I was alone, with no support system. But I found work and slowly began to rebuild my life. The bitterness and anger toward my parents still lingered, festering in the darkest corners of my heart. I couldn't forgive them for what they had done to me, for selling me off like I was nothing more than property. And as for the man I had been forced to marry, I didn't care if he had been kind or cruel. The fact that he had pursued a young woman when he was so much older disgusted me. I couldn't stand the thought of him, and I was glad I had escaped before things got worse. Now, months later, I'm living a life of my own making. I have a steady job, rented a modest apartment, and the freedom to make my own choices. It's not perfect, and I'm still healing from the trauma of everything that happened, but I'm finally free. Free from my parents' control, free from the man they tried to force me to love, free to be myself. And that, more than anything, is something worth fighting for. Update. Since I left, life's been a mix of relief and stress. My parents eventually tracked down my new number, and the calls were relentless. They called to scold me, saying I'd shamed the family and caused them endless trouble. They even tried to guilt me into coming back, insisting I was being selfish and that my actions had made them social outcasts. At first, the calls shook me. Part of me felt guilty, wondering if I'd done the right thing. But then I'd remember how alone I felt on my wedding day, the way they ignored my feelings just to get a bigger dowry. So, I blocked them. I don't know if that makes me a bad daughter, but I had to choose my own sanity. Anyway, I'm learning to stand on my own. Though I'm now working, paying my own rent, and slowly healing. It's still hard, and the loneliness hits sometimes, but I'd rather live with the uncertainty of this new life than go back to a life I never chose.